Over the past few months, mine violence has become synonymous with South Africa, given the labor unrest that has gripped the country's mining sector. Recently, South African Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan predicted that the country's mining sector was past its worst. But the world is watching to see if this prediction will indeed come to fruit.
Helicopters hover in the sky, barely blocking out the cries of a group of women who mourn the deaths of their husbands, fathers and sons at the Marikana mine. Mining communities under police surveillance is no longer an uncommon occurrence.
What started out as what was perceived as a few isolated incidents in some mining companies has now morphed into a wave of wildcat strikes that have swept across the South African mining sector with far-reaching consequences.
To date, nearly 50 people have been killed in the strike-related action.
The loss of life among workers and members of the police service is tragic and regrettable.
And the estimated total value of production lost due to industrial action and stoppages in the platinum and gold sectors is at a staggering 10.1 billion rand. This according to the National Treasury. The mining sector will need to restructure for the future and according to economists could shed up to 200,000 jobs in the next decade. Both Standard & Poor's and Moody's rating agencies have downgraded South Africa's credit rating, increasing the cost of borrowing. This, coupled with the UN's report highlighting that the country's foreign direct investment has tumbled nearly 44%, has left investors jittery.
Well, it is a cause for concern, but also you must bear in mind that South Africa is not an island. South Africa is part of the global environment. There's turbulence globally, and we are not immune from that. You know, we are very much aware, for instance, that 37% of our trading partners are in Europe. We know what's going on in Europe, and that has a direct bearing on how we perform as a country.
And although there may be fears that South Africa's mining crisis may stream to the broader community producing countries, African leaders are looking to find ways to bring stability to all sectors contributing to the economy.
We are a country which has challenges, but we are a stable country. We are a country which has opportunities for growing our economy. And when we overcome, I think globally, the situation of global challenges, South Africa will come out being the best because we are positioned to do that.
That's Mining Minister Susan Shabangu speaking to Misho Mahanyele. Still with me in the studio is Cobus Nel, mining analyst at Stanley, Warren Beach, head of mining at Routledge Modise, and also from our Cape Town studios we've got Peter Major, mining analyst at Cadiz Corporate Solutions. Peter, let me begin with you. Are miners always poor people in other parts of the world?
No, they're not. They're blue-collar workers, and sometimes they're near the highest paid of blue-collared workers, and that can apply to most countries. So they're not amongst the poorest people. A lot depends with the society they live in, because we spoke of Sweden and Norway. If you live in quite a socialistic state, and the government provides medical, provides welfare, provides infrastructure, provides education, maybe even assists with housing. If you have a very highly developed socialistic government, then you don't need to make too much money from the mining company, and that's kind of your free spending money. But if you live in a country, or if you operate in a mine in the wilds, then you better make a lot of money, because it's going to justify the high expenses you incur working out in the wilds, and you have to sustain yourself. Or it's hard to get a rule of thumb, Godfrey. There's 200 countries on this planet.
Yeah.
And you can't just take a miner's salary in one country and compare it with another, because you have to take into account the government, the social, the infrastructure, etc. as well.
Indeed. Now, I was reading today in The Star, there's a guy called Joe Sioka. He wrote on behalf of the Benchmarks Foundation, and he had some startling figures. I have not looked at these figures before. He says the top 3 executives at Lonmin, this is, I suspect, last year, and 46 million rand. And that equates to the 44 million rand that was earned by 4,200 rock drillers at Lonmin. Is there something wrong with the way we are compensating our executives versus the workers on the ground?
I think you can make a good case to have a hard look at executive compensation. And it might be on the tail end of a statistical graph. You might take 100% of the employees, and it might just be the top 1%, or it's probably even the top 0.1% that do look quite out of line.
Yeah.
And whether we go back to Rockefeller, Carnegie, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, I think a lot of those gentlemen 100 some years ago said they didn't know why the top executive in a company needed to make more than 30 times the lowest paid person in that company. And I think that warrants merit, that warrants investigation. But we can also say, if we've adopted capitalism in this country like the other 199 countries have, if we think capitalism is the best religion on the planet and we're all 100% sold on it, and we think the best thing we can do in the Sunday Times is brag up who's making the most money, and if the top person in the Sunday Times is worth 20 billion rand and he made 10 billion rand last year, or was it 2 billion rand, I think that equated to the salaries of 13,300 rock drillers. So yes, mining executives, are their salaries out of line? Maybe a lot of them, the 0.1% are. But if we're living in a capitalist world, then we can't just pick on mining. We got to pick on banking, manufacturing, and all the other companies as well.
Absolutely, that conversation has to extend to them. I get part of what we're trying to do, if I can come to you, Warren, is that we're trying to find answers to what happened, why Marikana happened, and why it's spreading and is finding support in the other communities that companies mine in South Africa. Is there perhaps a need to look at the issue around compensation as part of the reason and part of the reform that we need now to start looking at as we try to find the answers?
Godfrey, I have spent quite a bit of time up in Marikana, and I have not seen that amount of barbed wire, razor wire, armored vehicles since the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. It's an environment which has created a dire need to investigate and to look at compensation mechanisms within the industry. But it cannot be viewed in isolation. It's part of the greater cost structures of a particular mining entity. And it cannot be looked at in isolation. It's part of the certainty that is required that Peter referred to. It's part of the risk factors which are taken into account, and the fact that in many, we were talking about the hard rock mining side of things, the fact that the infrastructure is old, that the mining deposits are moving further and further away from existing infrastructure. It's part of a bigger picture and the cost associated with investing in mining in South Africa. Absolutely,
it is part of the bigger issues that we need to deal with. Now, one of the points that Joe Sioka, who I referred to earlier, spoke about, he had this line where he said, you're speaking about widespread poverty, you're speaking about exclusion, you're speaking about profiteering, in part answering to what we're saying. So what else do we need to look at beyond the pace? Surely there are bigger issues here. I mean, we talk about the structures around these mining communities, but everywhere where you go in South Africa, you go around these mining communities, you are seeing poverty.
And look, I mean, poverty is not a problem that just South Africa.
Sure.
I mean, you can look, across the world again, and ultimately it is to try and find a balance, where you can say, ultimately we want to try and get the best out of a area. Now, maybe the communities, there's been a lot of focus on communities around mines and they've been underdeveloped, etc., etc. But there's other complexities within that. People were given an option of a housing allowance, say for argue's sake, and they can live in a more permanent structure, and then they opted for a sleep out allowance.
For a cheaper one.
And then they send,
you get more money in your pocket.
100%, and they send their money home, and then they choose to go and live in a very sort of informal type of shack type of structure with no sort of services, etc., etc. Now, if you come there and you look at it, you say, something's not right here. But if you take a step back, it could have looked very different if different decisions was made. So do you enforce these type of things on people? And then some people will say, we're moving back again to the 80s? And that's what I'm saying. It's very complicated.
It is very complicated. It's interesting you raised that comparison, because I remember making the same comparison years ago. An employer I used to work for would insist that every time you flew more than 4 hours, you have to fly business class. And there were grumblings among the workers. No, I don't want to fly business class. Just give me the difference between the business class ticket and the economy class ticket. Anyway, let's find answers here. So what do we do? What do we need to change, reform, add, input? Do something. What do we need to change to make things right now? We've got 3 minutes to do this. Let me begin with you.
I would say, first of all, and as Peter said, it's you got more. You need more certainty. You need more structure.
From government?
From government and from the whole sort of investment process, the way, the expectation of labour in general, the commitment to labour. You know,
Right.
when you go into projects, you got to have more certainty around it. Like we said, currently if you try and build a house on sand, we all know what's going to happen. So I think that is the first step. And if we can get that right, I think, you know, we're a long way down the path.
Right. Certainty.
Godfrey, South Africans are desperate to be positive to the rest of the world and
I
invite
had
the
Paul
investment.
Harris last night.
And we are desperate for to send that positive message out. When it comes to the mining industry, certainty, consistency, transparency, the three cornerstones that we need see in place to make sure that it's an environment which is investor friendly, not only internally but also externally.
Certainty, consistency, transparency is what we're taking from Warren. Peter, what do we take from you?
Yeah, very close. You need education. You need transparency. You need honesty, and you need discipline. And if the workers in government mining companies agree to something, everybody must adhere to that. But education, we talked about poor miners, rich miners. I saw the miners who make the least on many mines had the highest living standard. And often the miners who made the most, they just blew it. Government's got to be honest. They've got to tell miners the facts of life. They can't be populist, and everybody has to adhere to agreements. And we've got to educate everyone so they utilize the resources and salary in a better way than not squandering it.
Peter, but you're forgetting another one, and you're forgetting who is talking to you. I'm a journalist. What we do is we communicate. And I dare say that one of the reasons why Marikana happened is because there was no communication.
You're so right. Bad communication. Yeah.
It certainly needs to be addressed.